Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Fitzgerald. I'm going to be teaching all of our Year 3 and Year 4 classes the history unit while we're in the COVID lockdown at the moment. So I'm really enjoying the history unit, learning all about Paddington. I hope that you're enjoying it too. I'm finding it so interesting and it's all about your local area. I'm wondering if you're starting to make a few connections with things that you see around the Paddington area and some of the history that we've been looking at. I'm going to go to our presentation, so I'm just going to share the screen. And when I start, I'm going to just backtrack a little bit because it has been 4 weeks since we've done any history. And because building Victoria Barracks at Paddington was an enormous part of how Paddington began to develop. And we'll backtrack just to why they needed the new barracks, because the Sydney colony had been growing where Sydney City is now. And where Wynyard Station or Wynyard Park is now was where the original barracks were built for the soldiers who were needed to guard the convicts in the new colony. And it was quite a big building. You can see there a sketch of the original barracks at Wynyard. And it occupied a large area of land that was sort of blocking the way that the colony could expand. So they couldn't build roads through it. They needed housing and shops. And it was just land that was being used for the soldiers' housing. So they needed to move it somewhere that wasn't quite so in the middle of the Sydney. So they decided to build the new barracks on South Head Road, which we now know as Oxford Street, because it was high on the ridge line and it gave good views of Sydney Harbour in case of attack. It had access to water because it was close to Centennial Park, which was then called the Lachlan Swamps. It also had a good source of sandstone that they would need for building. And so in 1841, building commenced at the barracks. It was completed in 1848. So quite quickly, considering how big the building was, not just the building, but all of the grounds and the walls around the grounds. We're still hoping that we might be able to get an excursion to go in there, but that will depend on, because it's an acting army base still, that will depend on whether the army allow us in, which they haven't been since COVID started. Okay, the barracks were huge, and this became the real reason why Paddington began to develop. Okay, up until now it had just been a bit of farmland, and it had the gin distillery, and it had a couple of large houses, but there wasn't very much else there. And when they decided to build the barracks there, they were going to need lots of labourers, and they were using convict labourers. So they also, convicts who were doing a lot of the hard work, but they also used a lot of free settlers and emancipists. So emancipists are convicts who have been freed. And they needed stonemasons and carpenters and blacksmiths and plumbers and all of those sort of trades that go into making a building. Now, the workers for this building also had families, and back in those days, they didn't have public transport, so people usually lived close to where they worked. So they needed more family homes, and they needed smaller blocks of land because these weren't rich people who were working on the building. Now, along with all of these people who were working on the building and their families, they also needed a lot of services to help support them. So people like bakers and shops and businesses and hotels. And these were mainly established along Oxford Street, where they still are today. They also needed housing for the families of these people who provided those services. Okay, so that was why Victoria Barracks became so important, because that drove the people moving into the Paddington area. It was named Victoria Barracks after the Queen, who was then presiding in England after Queen Victoria. Now there's just an idea of two paintings that were done around this same time, just after the barracks were built. This one is by Henry Lloyd in 1856 from somewhere around Paddington. It looks to me as though it's on the ridge line going down to what looks like Rushcutters Bay down there. And again, this one you can see is there's the harbour there, and this road coming here is actually Glenmore Road in 1861. Okay. Now, during the time while Underwood was subdividing the Paddington estate, which we talked about before, the area was being opened up through the development of Glenmore Road. And this created land for some of the wealthy families of Sydney to build substantial houses. Substantial means large. Okay, so if we look at the map here, and I know it's a little bit hard to see, we have got, here's Glenmore Road, here's Rushcutters Bay up here, here's Glenmore Road, the yellow road going along there. Okay, now we've already looked at Juniper Hall, okay, which is this site here, and Juniper Hall still exists today. So over here on this bend up near the top of where Glenmore Road joins on to Oxford Street, you would know it now, there's a lot of shops up there. That site was in 1843 that the barracks were being built. It was a private school built by William Cape, and William Cape was the first headmaster there. Okay, so we know it now as one of our houses at school, but it used to be an old school. Okay, this one here, again, there's Glenmore Road. This was Duxford House. It was also built in 1843. It was built by the Registrar of the Supreme Court, John Gurner. Okay, now we know Gurner because we've got Gurner Road and Gurner Lane. Bradley House is here. You can see there's a circular driveway in there. Okay, that's coming off from Glenmore Road, a road coming off from Glenmore Road. So that was Bradley House, built by Thomas Broughton, who was a merchant and one of the first mayors of Paddington. That was built in 1845, so 2 years later. And then we've got another big estate over here, which was Olive Bank Villa. Sorry, that was, oh yes, the Enchurst estate, sorry, and over here, adjoining it, is the Olive Bank Villa. Okay, and we've already talked about Juniper Hall being here, and you can see here is Victoria Barracks. Okay, so there were a few, Glenmore Road actually enabled a lot of these very rich families to build large houses on land that wasn't being used for anything else. Okay. In 1855, Governor Fitzroy approved a land grant next to Barkham Glen. Remember, Barkham Glen was where the West family had set up the flour mill. And they approved the land grant to a group of a religious order of nuns called the Sisters of Charity. They are still existing today and they still run the hospital. So they started building St Vincent's Hospital, which opened in 1870. Now, 3 generations of the West family had lived at Barkham Glen. There was Thomas, who was the original miller, his son Obed, and his wife and family of 13 children. Back in those days, they had a lot of children. Obed had begun to subdivide parts of Barkham Glen during the 1870s and 1880s, although he left most of the area uncleared. So what that means is that he subdivided the land, so he broke it into smaller pieces of land. He didn't bother clearing it for housing, he just sold them off as smaller parcels, and the people who bought them would have cleared them. And that became known as West's Bush. Obed lived at Barkham Glen until he died in 1891. In 1863, the remaining land of Barkham Glen was sold to the Sisters of Charity, who used it to expand St Vincent's Hospital. Okay, now we're up to the bit about the Paddington Reservoir. Now, we've talked before about Busby's Bore and how that had been used to supply water to the Sydney area since the 1830s. Remember, that was the very long bore that brought water from gravity-fed water from the Lachlan Swamps, which is now in Centennial Park, down to Hyde Park. As the area around Paddington became more settled, with more people moving in, there was a need for fresh water that could no longer be supplied by the creeks of the Paddington area. Okay, they'd been using these creeks, oh, sorry, not those ones. They'd been using their creeks around Paddington for their fresh water, but now they had too many people and it wasn't going to be enough. So in addition to the water at Lachlan Swamps, which had now been polluted, the council, not the Sydney Whole Council, decided that they needed to be able to pump more water from an area around Botany Bay. Okay, so the Paddington Reservoir, which is here, and that's where it is today, the Paddington Reservoir Gardens, was constructed in 1866. It was designed to hold water pumped from Lord's Dam, so that's Lord's Dam down here. Okay, here's Botany Bay, where the airport is now. Here's Long Bay, Maroubra Bay, Coogee Bay. Okay, so down here, in between Botany Bay and Maroubra Bay, was an area called Lord's Dam. And they put in a bore to carry the water, which was fed through that area through Randwick there. This area here is called the Racecourse Reserve, so it wasn't yet a racecourse. We now know it as Randwick Racecourse, but it wasn't yet running as a racecourse. And then to Centennial Park, where it also picked up water and refreshed the water at Lachlan Swamp. Okay, so from Lachlan Swamp, they already had Busby's Bore that went through Paddington. So from there, they changed the drainage so that the bore would start to fill up the Paddington Reservoir. Okay, and some of us have been down there. Well, probably most of us have been down there. It's a beautiful area, but it was once an underground tank of water. Okay, and from there was also another reservoir down here. If I just move this out of the way, down here, which was the Crown Street Reservoir. And so the Paddington Reservoir was known as the High Reservoir and the Crown Street Reservoir was known as the Low Reservoir. And basically that was just holding water and people would come and use it and take it home for their families. After it closed in 1899, the Water Board used it to store their equipment, and for a while it was used as a petrol station until 1990, when the roof fell in. In 2006, the remnants of the reservoir's vaulted construction were preserved with a sunken garden that we now know as the Paddington Reservoir Gardens, or its other name is the Walter Reed Reserve. Okay, this will be our last slide for today. This is showing more of the subdivision of Paddington. Again, here's Rushcutters Bay up here. Here's our red outline of the council area of Paddington. We've got Victoria Barracks here. And you can see a lot of those big places of land that we were looking at that were the original houses we've now got a lot more housing built there. All of these grey lines in rows are all the Paddington terraces. Okay, so what we have here is that this land here is the remaining 47 acres from Underwood's estate that he subdivided. And so there were 606 lots. You can see they're very small. Well, they're the size of the Paddington terraces that we now know. Okay. What else have we got? Over here is the Sydney Common. That land was originally set apart for cattle grazing and sheep grazing and for outdoor exercise. A common area in an English town is like a parkland, a small parkland, but people back in those days could also have sheep and cattle on them as well. Okay, down at here was a home that was subdivided by MacDonald, and it was divided into 71 lots, plus another 33 lots that were adjoining to that. And here, this one here is another subdivision of the estate that was originally the Good Hope estate. So you can see that the big families that had large areas of land have now realised that they need the land for more housing, and if they sold off their land then and subdivided it, they could get a lot more money for it. You can also see down here that there's where the Chinese market gardens are. So this was all around 1870. And you can also see, here's Oxford Street, here's Victoria Barracks, that the development of Paddington started at the top of the hill and made its way slowly down into the bottom of the hill, down at Rushcutters Bay. Okay, now remember this was originally swamp, so it probably wasn't a very nice area to be living in. Okay, we're going to finish there now. I've got an activity for you to do, which will be in your resource pack. You might like to go back and have a look at some of this again, which I've recorded, so that will be easy for you to do. But you might also be able to, as you're walking around, having a bit of exercise during our lockdown, you might also find street names and places that you recognise as coming from the original settlement of Paddington. Okay, I'll leave it there. Bye everyone, and good luck with the rest of your learning. I'm going to stop share.